Okay, these are the 6 topics we're going to talk about tonight. Racetracks and Jersey Islanders. I know there's a few of you that are related to the Jersey Islanders and came here hoping to see some fun facts about that. The Mill Canal. Everybody's heard of it, seen it, but I'm going to show you some different views that you won't see anywhere else. Nabnasset Grove. I was just talking with Jeff Hall, who's past president of the Westford Historical Society, and he's doing a slideshow presentation on, guess what, Nabnasset. So he and I have some things to share here. And something I'm calling the Carrie Tyler House. There was a picture in the Historical Society that was labeled Carrie Tyler House. There was another version in the library that was labeled a large house on Main Street. So I've been thinking, I'm going to say for 10 or 12 years, ever since I first saw the picture, where is that house, who lived there, and who was Carrie Tyler? So I'm going to tell you tonight. And another one called Haunted Places, okay? So that's going to be a surprise to everybody, I think. First, we're going to talk about racetracks. You may or may not know that there was a racetrack in North Chelmsford. You knew there was one in the center of Chelmsford, where Route 495 went through, but we only have one photograph of this racetrack, and it's actually one small corner of a photo that's in the library's collection here. And if you look up here, you'll see a fence, goes all the way around. You see a racetrack going around here. It's a large oval racetrack. You see a grandstand, a house, 2-story house with some carriage and horse facilities. Off screen, there may have been some good-sized stables and accommodations for jockeys when they came in for races. They usually stayed overnight. So there's a couple other things that are interesting in this picture. One is there's a gate over here. Frank Harris, who didn't originate this facility, but he improved it. He had to have a fence around it to keep people from, freeloaders from coming in. So here is the entrance over here, and there was a kind of a path across the railroad tracks, and there was a path that went right up into Vinyl Square where the North Chelmsford Hardware is, because that's where the trolley station was. But notice over here, where's Watton Road? Not there. This barn over here, it says Hood's Sarsaparilla on it, because all the farmers used to, I guess they used to get a little extra cash for advertising, and C.I. Hood Company in Lowell is local. So that was Jim Watton's barn, and a few years later, James Southwell, an Englishman, built a mill down in this area here, Southwell Mill, and Watton Road was constructed right about where this fence is here, and went over the tracks. So let's take a look in a timeline here of Frank Harris's little venture. He was a hotel owner in Lowell. He had a place called the Harris House. It was a very successful hotel for 24 years. He's getting to the end of his career. He knew about this track in North Chelmsford, saw possibilities, sold his hotel, moved into the track. He actually lived there. So he purchased it in 1895. And during those years, he struggled. He worked very hard, built a beautiful track. He had some events, but he couldn't get the kind of traffic that he was looking for, and the big name events to recover the expenses and make the profit he was looking for. So he worked with it for a little over 5 years, and then he decided to go back into something that he knew would make some money, liquor. So I'm not sure if he still owned it. I assume he still owned it. It was auctioned off. If he abandoned it, it was auctioned off in 1903. It was being run as a farm. It's possible that he had somebody running it. And so in the inventory of the auction, there were huge loads of vegetables. There were pigs and horses and cows, all sorts of farm implements. And it was marketed as an ideal location for a pig farm. So those that live in the condos nearby probably wouldn't have appreciated a pig farm. Harris died in 10 years later in Lowell. So in the newspapers, there were a lot of articles. They were all like sports articles, racing fanatics. There were politicians, rich people, businessmen, and they all had big egos, and they all had the fastest horse in town. They all wanted to prove it. So they all had funny names or fancy names, and they were scheduling races among themselves, you know, to prove who's got the fastest and best. So didn't find any photographs other than the one that you saw. There were a couple of cartoons in 1897. This one right here on the left was Troop F Cavalry. They used to have occasionally a field day there. And a field day was sort of like a Boy Scout outing. The families would come and sit in the stands and watch, and the boys would go out with their toys and race around the track with the horses and stuff. So I don't think this is a very realistic depiction of what really happened there. And this is the end of a Surrey race. It says, the exciting finals in the last heat of the 32 class at Nabnasset Park yesterday. So they had classes of horse. I think it's kind of like a handicap. And this was the 32 class that they were depicting there. This is the sad way that the park faded away. If you look in 1938 at this, the website is historicaerials.com. This is where Williamsburg is today. You can see Williamsburg over here. But in 1938, you can still see the vestige of the track here. But after that point, sometime after 1903, somebody built another track. Notice it's 90 degrees to the first track. So that was kind of interesting. The other thing that you can see on this is there is actually the path. I think it's here. It's a little hard to see on this. There's actually a vestige of a little bridge over Deep Brook, and no path up here, but it was, you could see where it went across the tracks, and that was the path that went to the track. So on the actual photograph, you can still see the, that path. So we're here in 2005 now. There's Williamsburg. The place where the track was, this is a Lighthouse School, I think, and it's the baseball field. And this is a pond, probably a drainage swale, I'm not sure. And you can see there's no trace at all of the old track. So that was the end of it. There's no trace of it anymore. This is, oh, I didn't mention the first photograph was taken from the top of a 7-story tower on George C. Moore's warehouse. And this photo was taken, I believe, on the same day from the same tower, okay? And you can see the view is pretty spectacular. The tower is the biggest, it's right today, it's still the biggest building in Chelmsford. And over here on the other side of the river, what do you see? It looks like 2 straight roads connected with a turn at the end. Well, guess what? It was a racetrack right there. And the reason for the racetrack was that the automobile technology was improving. They were having races, and in turn the races improved the auto technology, the cars got faster, so the technology was just exploding. And the state at the same time was building state highways. Okay, here they were building State Road 113, and they got up to this point here. So somehow the state was sort of in collaboration with the auto enthusiasts, and they made a 1 mile, exactly 1 mile, perfectly straight, perfectly level road here for auto racing. And then there's another 3/10 of a mile, there's a slight bend, and then another 3/10 of a mile off in the distance there behind the trees. So this, that was back in 1898. So go forward 10 years now. There's so much interest in racing now, and there's a national series of races that they have different places around the country. And Lowell actually got the slot on Labor Day weekend. And they had 1908 and 1909. They had races here on Pawtucket Boulevard. So if you look here, here's the straight stretch, and here's about the third of a mile after a slight bend. They made this is a 10.6 mile course. It went all the way down this direction along what they call the State Boulevard, because now the road has been extended beyond this track. And at the Tingsboro Bridge, they call that the hairpin turn. And then back turns into Varnum Avenue and Lowell here. And then Dunbar Ave, they cut across and come back. This is the grandstand area right here. And they actually built a bridge right about here, not too far from where the Rourke Bridge is today. I think it was just downriver a little bit. A pedestrian bridge, temporary pedestrian bridge. So they went all out for this. And this fellow here, his name was John O. Hines. He owned the Hines Electric Company, and they made car parts. So he had a financial incentive to get people interested in cars and advance the technology. So I think he put a lot of his company's money into this, and he was also the Auto Club president. So this is the footbridge that they built, and it was quite a production. You notice that it's covered, so if it rains, they don't have to get wet. It was held by a cable because the river is flowing left to right. So think of a suspension bridge on its side. And this cable had all these small cables going off the side, holding the bridge against the current. And so people would walk, in their fine clothes to see the races. And there's one other feature that you can see here. There's a water tower with a windmill up on top right here. So I'm not sure what the function was, but I suspect it had to do with the races and may have been used to water down the dirt track, and also to water the horses and fill the radiators of the cars. And this is it right here. This is that water tower. And it also looks like it has an observation platform up here. So it may have been a place for people out on a pleasure trip on the daytime to take a walk up and see the view. So right here you see an old-fashioned steamroller, and this crew is here getting ready to roll the piles of dirt to make it perfectly level, smooth. And at this time, nationally, this track was known as the Merrimack Valley Course, not the Pawtucket Boulevard. It was the Merrimack Valley Course. This is the 1908 race. The stands are full. The excitement is building. They didn't release the cars at once. There was a delay between the release so that they wouldn't all pile into each other, especially going around the hairpin turn. But cars still did get lapped. And there were quite a few laps, so they got to see a lot here. It was 24 laps in 1908, and that added up to 250 miles. So that's a long race. And these cars didn't all make it. The other surprising thing, they had high displacement, but if you look at the horsepower on some of these cars, this was a 38 horsepower Knox. And this driver here, every driver had to have a mechanic with them, because if the car failed on the side of the road, you had to put it back together. If you had somebody like the farmer came over and said, here's a spare radiator, okay, you'd lose the race. You couldn't have outside help. It had to be your own parts and mechanic. So they had a lot of rules. As I say, he finished third. This was the number 6 car in the 1908 race. And this is one of my favorite pictures. These pictures are all from George Merrill, by the way, who's here in the back there. This was a number 2 car, and it was a 60 horsepower Fiat, so it's got a lot more horsepower than that Knox. And George Robertson was driving, but he had some technical troubles, and he ended up coming in 4th. But George came back in 1909, and he won that race. It averaged 54.2 miles an hour. So, and that's going around all those turns on a dusty road, so it's pretty hot stuff. Now this picture I love, because this guy here, you can just see him calling this smoke-filled room in Lowell just full of bookies, okay? think the Sting. So, and the other image I have is a whole bunch of guys waiting at their typewriters with their fingers ready to go. Because I actually did see newspaper articles that were written halfway through the race. So they published a newspaper with the results halfway through. So maybe he was talking to his friends back at the Lowell Sun. Now this is the grandstands in 1909, and they built the stands a little bit higher. They actually built a pedestrian bridge over the top here, and it said in one article that they had actually built a tunnel for the cars to get inside, or for people to get in and out of the inside of the zone. And I think it was over at Dunbar Avenue. I think they actually built a bridge over a passageway rather than digging a tunnel under the ground. But anyway, they had big ambitions. So they invited to this race, they invited President Taft, they invited the governors of all 6 New England states. So I don't know how many came, but they were invited. They had, the only mistake they made was they spread it out. They had 2 days of auto racing in 1908. They had 6 days of auto racing in 1909. It spread it too thin. So financially, it was a pretty big loser. But they had some excitement. The headliner here was Barney Oldfield, if you've ever heard of him. He had a great big Benz, this monstrous Benz with 120 horsepower and a German mechanic that came with it. And so he wasn't a contestant, he was more of an exhibitor. And he ran a few of the races for exhibition. Of course, he blew the doors off everybody he raced, but the big highlight was he was trying to beat the world speed record. So you do it from a running start. So he goes down that mile strip that you saw in the first photo as fast as he can, okay, and he actually did it in 90.2 miles an hour. And he was just shy of the world speed record. He didn't quite break it, but he had the possibility. His other run, he did 2 runs, his other run was just a little bit slower. But my favorite racer wasn't Barney Oldfield. You know, he was too professional. This was a rough and tumble brilliant mechanic, genius, and fearless driver, okay? This guy right here, driver is Louis, and he was driving for the Buick team. A fellow by the name of William Durant was head of General Motors during this year, and William Durant hired 2 drivers, Louis and his brother Arthur, to drive on his Buick team. And one of the races, Louis came in first and his brother came in second. And unfortunately, in the big race, I mentioned that George Robertson won the race. Louis had to drop out in the 4th because he had a frame on his Buick cracked or broke. So he was out of that race. But Louis had interesting history when I started reading about it. The next year, William Durant got fired or let go from General Motors. So he started a new auto company, and he was going to create a brand new line of sedans, a higher quality sedan. So he hired this guy Louis to come on board and engineer this new design. So for 2 years, in 1912, they came up with a good design, good solid 6-cylinder car. And Louis actually had some real innovations. I read a bunch of innovations, but I can't remember them all, so I'm not going to rattle them off. But anyway, Louis, he's kind of a hot-headed guy. The car was starting to become very successful, and they actually sold many thousands by 1914. But Durant wanted to bring in a lower model car to compete with Ford, a lower cost car to compete with Ford. This really upset Louis because they were using Louis's last name for the car company. He didn't want to be identified with a lower quality car. So if any of you can guess, we all know Louis by his last name. And what was interesting was he sold all his stock to William Durant before he left. And it was after that the Chevrolet company took off, and he would have been a millionaire if he'd just hung on to those shares. Multi-millionaire, because he was in on the ground floor. So afterward, he and his brother Arthur built aftermarket racing kits for Model T Fords. Then the Model A came out, so they had to do something else. So they designed an aircraft engine. They called it the Chevrolet Air 333. And it was a very good engine, and it was successful at on the low-level production they were doing. So they got another guy by the name of Glenn Martin in as a partner, and they were building these Chevrolet 333s, and then the Depression came along. But Arthur and Louis, being hotheads, they couldn't get along real well, so they were always at each other. And during the Depression, when times were bad, Glenn Martin ended up with all the assets and the designs for the 333 engine. He started his own aircraft company based on Louis' engine design, okay? And of course, we all know, well, he had a very, very successful company, and we all know that company. So again, Louis missed the boat. He was in on the ground floor. So I felt bad for him. He ended up late in his career. He was short on cash. He ended up working for Chevrolet, and then he got diabetes. And you know, it was so sad because he was not recognized by Chevrolet until the 1960s, long after he was dead. He died in the 40s. Felt sorry for the guy. Now we're going to talk Jersey Islanders. So I want to give you a little introduction because I had no idea where or what the Jersey Islands were. Okay, so this is your crash course. This is London up here, England, English Channel. This is Upper Normandy, Lower Normandy. These are the Jersey Islands, Jersey and Guernsey, first and second largest island. Everybody knows that's where the cows were bred. And in 1066, during the Norman conquest, Normandy and the islands became part of England. And after that, in 1259, Normandy was returned by King Henry III, but not the Channel Islands. So the Channel Islands stayed with England, and Normandy went to France. So up here, there are 7 inhabited islands, and right now they're crown dependencies. They're not part of the EU, and neither will England be soon. And the top governing person in each of these islands was called a bailiff, which is a little bit strange because we think of a bailiff as somebody that works in court. Okay, well, a bailiff was like the governor of the island, and the territory that the bailiff controlled was called a bailiwick. So when you say, not in my bailiwick, that's not in my bailiwick, okay, there's a real reason where that expression came from. So anyway, the bailiwick of Jersey is the largest island. Guernsey included Alderney, Sark, and Herm. These were the inhabited islands, and then there's 2 other privately owned islands. There's a bunch of other small ones that aren't inhabited. So there's a story, this naval officer called George Carteret, okay, he was a very high-level naval officer, rose up through the ranks. He was a royalist. He was actually, his name was de Carteret, but because he was in with English royalty, it sounded too French, so he actually removed the DE from the front of his name, but he was a de Carteret. And in 1642, King Charles I had a little argument with Parliament. He said that he reported only to God, and that the Parliament couldn't tell him, couldn't override him, couldn't tell him what to do. So Parliament said, no, that's not the way it works. So King Charles I, instead of sitting down with Parliament and working it out, he got his royal friends, relatives and friends together and formed an army to go convince Parliament that he was right and they were wrong. So Parliament formed an army to defend themselves. And so we had a civil war going. And where I'm leading with the story is that George Carteret saw the writing on the wall, so he moved his family, and a bunch of like-minded royalists didn't want anything to do with the Civil War. It's much worse than the way I was describing it. They went to Jersey Island, okay, and lived there to wait out the war. So one of the people that he harbored on the island was Charles II, who was Charles I's son. Now, the battles that went on up through 1649 were stalemates for the most part. They had huge battles, huge loss of life, and ended up losing 6% of the population of England. So, whoops. So, well, you all know what happened to Charles I? They took him into court. Okay, Oliver Cromwell formed an army on behalf of the Parliament. It was a big army, modern equipment, overwhelming army. So they finally took control, stopped the Civil War. They went and got Charles, brought him to court in January of 1649, and they convicted him of treason by means of putting his own interests ahead of the public good. And the next day they chopped his head off. So we all know the story. I was surprised at how that was described, you know, how the execution sentence was, or the reason for executing him was described. But anyway, this fellow Carteret declared Charles II king on the island, and then a few years later, during the Restoration, 1660, Charles II became the king on the British throne. So to thank Carteret, Naval Officer Carteret and Bailiff Carteret for harboring him during the war, taking good care of him and his royal friends, he was given 2 proprietorships in America. One was there were 8 proprietors in the territory in America that became North Carolina. 1/8 of North Carolina. Not a bad reward. The other one, there was 2 proprietorships, and it was everything east of the Delaware River. Okay, and Carteret got the honor of naming that. Can you guess what he named that other territory? New Jersey. So he and the other fellow actually owned New Jersey. And that's where the name New Jersey came from this fellow right here. So that was the point of that whole story. Sorry about that. These were the only British islands occupied during the war. The British were there the Germans were there 1940 to 1945. And there was a nice mini-series. Carol and I watched that years back in 2003 when it came out, called Island at War. Island without an S. It was very interesting. It was a composite of actual events that happened on Jersey. Okay, now we're talking about the Jersey Islanders in North Chelmsford. The stonecutters, John de Carteret and John Le Marinel, came to North Chelmsford in 1890. Not sure what the reason was. Maybe they were looking for opportunities. Maybe work was letting up in Jersey. But anyway, they found good opportunities, good granite to cut, nice people. So they sent letters back home, starting a migration. So about 50 years later, there were 50 Jersey Islanders all living within a mile of each other in North Chelmsford. And some of these family names, if you'll allow me to mispronounce them, we have O'Doyne, Benest, Bootloop, Brake, de Carteret, Delahaye, it's Lamazery, right? Or Lamazery, okay. See, I told you I'd get it wrong. Machon, I called it Mallory, but George tells me it's Mallory. Marinel. By the way, the Le Marinels that came over, they dropped the L-E and became Marinel. Sivret, I said, what kind of a name is that? Is that a misspelling? So I went on a website that has all the Jersey Islanders, and I couldn't believe it. It was like Smith. And then there was Thomas and Toms and Vaseline. So I ran into almost all of these names when I was doing research for this little project. So here we have, it's called Mallory Ledge. We have quite a few pictures of quarries. I'm just going to show you just a few here. This one was kind of neat. This one is Marinel and Wilsteed Quarry. There were different partnerships, and then they had separate quarries as well. So the story behind this, this is Charlie Wilsteed over here, but here's the real story. This fellow is George W. Merrill, and why is he working here? Because his grandfather owned a large quarry on Oak Hill in Westford, and here he is working at the Marinel and Wilsteed Quarry. So here's what happened. He was working at Fletcher Quarry in Westford, and in 1923, he tried to organize, he was a blacksmith, by the way. He tried to organize a union. So guess what happened? He got fired. So he needed work. So here he is over here working for Merriam and Wilstead. He lived on Dingwell Street over in Lowell, so he wasn't actually a Chelmsford guy. His grandson is here. And you'll hear more about him later, along with Dingwell Street, where he lived. Okay, this is just one view of the Merrill Quarry. I picked this one because it shows, it's about 300-foot elevation on Oak Hill, and you actually have kind of a panoramic view. George tells me you can see Boston, and you can see Mount Wachusett and Monadnock?
Monadnock.
Yeah, from Oak Hill. So the guys working up here had a nice view. This one was taken in the wintertime. But this also, this piece of equipment right here brings me to an oh crap story. George came over to the house, and we were talking about things, and then on the way out, he turns to me and says, "Oh, by the way, what's the other kind of crane, George?" Jury, not jury rig.
Yeah, which one?
The other kind. Gin pole, yeah. George, on the way out, he says, "By the way, those aren't gin pole cranes, those are derricks."
Oh, gin pole.
Oh, crap. So when you read the book, you'll see why I said, oh, crap. Okay, this is a Google Earth view. Okay, I'm going to show you where the Jersey Island quarries were, okay? Fletcher, we know, wasn't associated with Jersey, but starting up here, this one right here is the Merrill Quarry. It's a pretty good-sized quarry, and it was operated by the Mallorys, and then the Morris brothers took over after that. So there's another little quarry. As you drive in, it's right in here. And that was a DeCarteret quarry. No, sorry. That was a Marinell quarry. So the Marinell quarry was right near the Merrill quarry. It was on the way in. And there's a DeCarteret quarry, which is down here. So you've got Marinell, and you got LeMaisry, you've got DeCarteret, and you've got another DeCarteret. This is the school. Everybody knows the development here, Greystone. This is the elementary school they built in Greystone. Well, right there in the middle is the oldest DeCarteret quarry. There's still actually a pond in the trees right near the school there. So this is LeMaisry quarry here. Wait a minute. Did I get it wrong? Yeah, I did.
No,
This is LeMaisry here. LeMaisry. I'll try to get that. This one over here is the Marinell quarry, right, George?
yes.
Yeah. I said it was up here, but I was wrong. This is George's quarry. This is the DeCarteret, and this is the older DeCarteret quarry. This is LeMaisry, and there's a deep pond over here, and that's called Uncle Joey's Hole, because John is here tonight, and his Uncle Joey worked that quarry. And there was a Wilstead quarry over here. This is the Oak Hill area. Part of it's owned by the town now, and part of it's owned by the Congregational Church. So you'll be able to walk through here. It's now they're building access road, access path, I mean, and that's going to be public land. And there's a lot of historic artifacts from the quarry days. Okay, now I'm going to talk to you about a family in Jersey, a Mashon family, and show you their connections to North Chelmsford. Interesting characters. Joshua, he was a pretty good businessman. He had a quarry operation on Jersey, and for 3 years he had a sailing ship in the spice trade, and he ran a pretty good-sized farm on Jersey. And on the winter, they had some summer homes. They went, or winter homes. They go down to the shore and near the ocean in a beautiful scenic spot. And they had homes where the family vacationed, because in the summertime they'd be working on the farm. So Anne Quirret, notice she was his second wife, and notice she's much, much younger. Much, much younger. I mean, what, 30? More than that, huh? I think it's, let's see, that's when they were born. Oh, I'm sorry. My fault, it's 1819. Somebody, I think Sandy Johnston she pointed out the one error, and when I first opened the book after it was completely published and I received the whole box of books, I opened the page and I see, oh my God, that's not 1980, that's supposed to be 1890. And Sandy pointed that out to me. So anyway, this is another one of those. So, yes, so the difference between 54 and 19 is our age difference. So they had 8 children, 5 girls and 3 boys. And if you look at the ages here, it pretty much boggles your mind. You've got Joshua, 82, Christine, 83, Eveline, 84, Ophelia, 85, Eliza, 86. I'm tired just thinking about it. And then you've got some more here. You got 88, 91, and 93. So it looks like they took a few years break in between. So I'm going to call this guy Theophily because Theophile doesn't sound, it sounds kind of weird.
Theophilus.
They called it Theophilus.
Theophilus, okay, that's good. And is it Eveline? So I'm actually able to show you where every single one of those people went, and except Joshua, Elder Joshua. His son is Joshua also, but Elder Joshua died in 1901. So there were several families already in North Chelmsford. One of those families was de Carteret, and de Carteret lost his wife in 1900. So I'm not sure if that was why she went over because of de Carteret's loss and her loss, or if she just had 5 girls and 3 boys and a huge farm to run, and it was going to be impossible to make ends meet. So for whatever reason, in 1903, many of them went over, and she married John de Carteret as his second wife. So here we go. This is actually their farm as it looks today. It's really beautiful. It's on, the road is called Lallet. It's in the town of Trinity. I went into Google. There's only one farm on that whole road, so I knew exactly which one it was. And it's beautiful. And if you go up the coast this direction, they had some winter cottages down on the waterfront. And if you go up the coast this direction, right on the coast, is a large quarry, which may have been Joshua's. So they left. They came to North Chelmsford. Eliza went to, she married John Toms in 1905, and they lived in this house here. So Pat is here tonight with us. Right there, he just waved against the wall. And she's a Toms. Now, later in life, the mother, Anne, after de Carteret died, the mother went and lived at their house with the Toms in this house right here. Eveline married, oh, I forgot to tell you, when I was showing that picture of the garden, they hired an older, he was like 12 years younger than Anne. They hired a gardener who was an orphan in France, and his name was Octave Leroux. So he came over and he ran the farm for the family. Well, in spite of their age difference, Eveline ended up marrying the gardener, Octave Leroux. And they came and lived in this house right here, which is actually one of our historic homes in Chelmsford that we have on inventory. And he went into the ice business, and he's the guy that harvested the ice on Swain Pond. And I got a picture a little later of some equipment he built. Christine Machon married Thomas John LeMaisry. So one thing I've noticed in doing this, they seem to love the name John. Anybody else notice that? You got John Toms, John LeMaisry, and you had the 2 Johns de Carteret that came over. So anyway, there's a little story about Christine. She was a very kind-hearted person, kind-hearted, and there was a girl, an English girl, whose parents were killed or died. I'm not sure if it was disease or accident. She was stuck over here in this country. All her family was back in England. There was nobody here to take care of her. Christine heard about it by some means, read about it, heard it by word of mouth. She had some money saved in the kitchen, in the cookie jar or something, and she rounded up the money and financed the girl's passage back to England. So at a later point in time, the grandfather was so grateful for her kindness, he sent the deed to a 10-acre property in North Chelmsford to Christine, and she, that actually is how Thomas John started the quarry that they have over there on Oak Hill. I'm sure they have purchased a lot more land since then, but I thought that was kind of a heartwarming story about, it may have been the people that were killed may have had, you know, they may have been the ones to use that property, and he gave it to Christine, okay, because of her kindness. Then we've got Theophilus Machon, who was a pattern maker, and he married Harriet de Carteret, okay? So this is a fun one. He married Harriet de Carteret in 1914. She was the daughter of his stepfather, John de Carteret. So on paper, they look like brother and sister, but there's no blood relationship whatever, okay? Then Joshua Machon, he's the oldest son, a carpenter. He married Agnes Edge in 1925, a little bit later. He came over later, so he stayed in Jersey for a while. And they lived in this house right here. Now, Agnes, his first husband, was a Wright, and she had a son. So Joshua had a stepson. And over here, Joshua Machon's stepson, William Edge, he married Eleanor LeMaisry, widowed daughter-in-law of Thomas J. LeMaisry. So if you can wrap your head around all that, it takes a while. There's no blood relationship there either. And they built this smaller house, and if you notice, it's number 166, right in between 164 and 168. So the family is all right close together. And Philip, the other son, married Martha B. Swanwick, and they lived in this little house. And it says 120 Dunstable Road. Now, sad to say, this house, various owners rented it out, and it was abused, and then it was left vacant, and it got vandalized. So it was actually torn down. The good news is, there's a brand new house there. It's beautifully landscaped. It's a nice house. Its address is actually on Diamond Street, because that house is on the corner of Diamond. And right across Diamond Street at number 16 is where Lydia Machon, who married Clarence G. Wadge in 1919, that's where she lived. And the last sibling, Ophelia, she married John Vasselin, and they lived on Newfield Street. So they're the only ones that didn't live right next to Dunstable Road. So I thought it was pretty incredible to take an old picture, find these people, and find out, thanks to some help from some Jersey friends here, where they all went. This is Octave LaRoe's conveyor belt for his ice house. And notice he had to power it, he had a belt driven by a steel wheel tractor down here. So I thought that steel wheel tractor was pretty neat. And here's the crew out here actually harvesting the ice. This is the descendants of John LeMaisry. I went to John, to Tom, and then to John and John. So this is like fourth generation. And here we have, this is the present John who's here tonight. And this is his brother Stephen. This is his brother Richard. Everybody calls him Cheddar. So I asked the other sister, why do they call him Cheddar? And she said, well, she wasn't sure, but when he was little, he always used to like to eat cheese. I guess that's as good an explanation as you can get. And this is Andrew, that's John's son. This is back in 2010, they made a sign for University of Lowell. It's another picture, John actually trimming up a stone. And this is a project I actually worked with John on. and that's his son Jason there. And here's John guiding the stone. This is in the Chelmsford Public Garden, and my wife and I donated this bronze plaque here, and John and the LeMaisry families actually donated, they ended up donating the stone. So if you drive by Town Hall by the Common, you'll see that stone. And now you know who put it there, Jersey Islander. Next we're going to talk about the Mill Canal. I love waterways, and I was always fascinated by the canal and wondered, gee, where did it go? What did it look like? So I can show you. It took me a while to figure it out. This is at the end of Wilson Lane in West Chelmsford. This is the control gate that the flow of water that goes into the pond, Freeman Lake now. This is the spillway that goes down into Stony Brook. So this whole thing here is a reservoir. It's called a reservoir, and this sets the level of the pond water, and this sets the flow. There's actually a gate. Normally it's either on or closed for maintenance. This is a 1856 map of the canalway. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is that reservoir. This is where the split was that I just showed you. Stony Brook goes down and crosses under the tracks, goes over here, crosses again, and goes over underneath Princeton Street. This is Princeton Street here. The canal goes over here underneath Meadowbrook Road. It goes into what was called Newfield Pond then, later Crystal Lake. This is 1856. It was called Newfield. And this is the canal going to the mills right here, and it goes over to the mill. I'll show you another chart a little bit later time. This is the feeder canal after it comes out of the control gate. And notice that there was a walkway, a kind of a towpath, and also used for maintenance, of course. And it's kind of a scenic place to walk. And people today think, gee, could it be resurrected? And so there are people that are thinking about resurrecting the towpath. It's been improved since this point. The canal was actually raised by George C. Moore. Now we're on the other side of Crystal Lake, and this is looking back at the lake here. This is downstream going this direction. This is Spring Street here. Or is it? Yeah, I think it's Spring Street. That's the Spring Street Bridge. This is looking downstream now, the Spring Street Bridge. This is the Boston Ice Company barn, and now that you've read the book, you know who started the Boston Ice Company and who ran it most of its time that it was. There's one thing I could never figure out in this picture. It looks like there's a building here. I never understood what that building was until I found this picture right here. There's the Spring Street Bridge, and there is another powered ramp to get ice up, and then it would go down the hill to there was a railroad siding, so it would go down the hill. They loaded in boxcars in the winter once the ice houses were full. So they actually had two of these ramps. One of them got washed away in the 1905 washout. This one probably just was disused and fell apart. But that's the old Spring Street Bridge right there. Okay, this is the next chart. It's a little bit newer, 1889. And the canal comes in this way. After it goes under Spring Street, comes down here. This is the Baldwin Mill. And then it goes over here. This is incorrect. That actually goes straight across underneath. This is the George T. Sheldon's house here. It goes underneath his lawn, underneath Princeton Street, and it comes out over here. And this is George C. Moore's mill here. So that was the layout. But the interesting thing here is Stony Brook, if you look right here, it was wide. There was actually a dam here. And there was actually a mill, an old mill here. George C. Moore bought it. He ended up using this as a storehouse. And he tore down that dam. What he did was he corralled the river into a channel and built a 5-story tall building on top of it with a 7-story tall tower that those pictures were taken from that you saw. So this shows what the river looked like before. This is, I meant to show this right here, the canal comes right near the edge of the Baldwin Mill, and you can see there's an access road here. So in the next picture, this is the access road right here, and this is actually the wall that you see in the canal. There's actually a towpath on top, and then the canal's on the other side. And there's only one picture in existence, thank goodness, that shows what it looked like. And if you look here, the canal comes around the backside of the Baldwin Mill, which is here, and it comes down here. There's actually a gate where you can dump water. It goes down here. It comes over here, and there's a grate, and there's a tunnel that comes under here. This is George T. Sheldon's house. Comes under his lawn. It comes across here. You don't see it on this side, but it actually comes out and goes through what's now a parking lot. So that was the route of the canal. And from here back, it curves around, and you can actually see the canal over here. It does a loop around the Baldwin Mill. It comes out here and then goes up like this, up to the pond. This is 2015. This is what the reservoir, that's the gate over there, and this is the spillway. This is the control gate, a little close up here. It shows if they had an emergency, they had to stop the water coming into Freeman Lake. They would drop this wooden gate. And this is the inlet to Freeman Lake. It's full of lily pads and invasive purple loosestrife, which are kind of pretty. And this is the outlet, which is the canal. You can see the blocks, and they were put in after that 1905 disaster where the water spilled out. Of course, there was another one in 1970. Now you know about both disasters because they're both in the book. So what happens to the water as you go down the canal? Well, this is what it looks like. Now, this fellow in this cottage had a serious problem. He built the cottage. He had a gentleman's agreement with some neighbors in back that he could drive through their property to get to his cottage. And the gentleman's agreement expired. Okay. Now, maybe that they sold the property. They couldn't deed it over. The new buyers didn't want somebody with a right to drive across. And there wasn't any legal right, just a gentleman's agreement. So he came to the Historical Commission and said, you know, can I fill in the canal? And we said, well, you know, it's historic. And he said, well, you know, it's already been mostly filled in. So we said, okay, we'll go take a look. So we went out and take a look. And sure enough, this had been pretty well filled in with rubble. And there was a path going across. But he did the right thing by asking permission, because we actually gave him permission. He said he was going to make this look like a bridge. It's not a bridge. It's a causeway filled all the way to the bottom. Okay. So the canal does not go any further. It'll never be restored unless this is actually turned into a bridge. And there's no need for a canal anyway. So that's what happened at the beginning of the canal. So the rest of the canal is totally dry and just overgrown with brush. This is the other end of the canal bed that exists today. You can see the parking lot of the condominiums where the Baldwin Mill was. This little box here, this is a stone wall that was built to stop the flow of water from going beyond this point. This was a valve. Now, Gillette Mill needed water, but they also needed an access road, so they wiped out the canal to improve the access road. And they terminated it here and made a pipeline to get the process water down to their plant for their scouring operations. So here's another view of the, I assume there's a valve. I didn't take the top off to see what was in there, and it's probably not been used since 1986 when the property was sold for commercial development. But this shows you this is how the canal was terminated at this end. So from here down to that faux bridge, that's what the canal looks like today. It's mostly trees, brush. This is a view from that spot where the terminator was to the mill, it's called now. It was Gillette Mill, and it was developed by Braeburn, and now it's called the mill. This is what looks like going underneath George Sheldon's lawn, okay? This is the grate, and there was a tunnel. And I thought you might like to see what it looked like inside the tunnel. I see some nods here. Okay, this was the lawn. This was George C. Moore's lawn. Company came along. They got permission to build 7 condominium complex here called Princeton Ridge. And engineers said, no, you can't have a canal underneath the foundation. So, and it's a good thing because I'll show you what the top of it looked like, and it never would have survived. But anyway, they've got the site cleared and invited the Historic Commission to come over. So they took the topsoil off the canal and lifted a couple of, see, these are granite slabs, so they have very little strength in that particular mode. You could take one sledgehammer, you could probably break through that. They made an effort to lift them out in one piece. So I had the daunting task of going into this black hole, okay, with the camera. So I'm thinking, oh no, are there rats, spiders, creepy crawly things? What's in there? So my heart is pounding, and when I got permission from the contractor to go down in there, so here we are, inside the only surviving section of the tunnel. So it's very well constructed, and there was nothing alive in there at all, I'm happy to say. And the floor was actually, hard soil. It wasn't like soft or anything. There was like a Dixie cup and a straw and a cement block and very little else. The only thing that was alive down there on the side walls, there had been some roots growing down. So there were these old dried out roots that had grown down. So then going all the way to the other end, you can see Princeton Street, is right here. It drops down a little, so the tunnel gets a little lower as you go through the other side. So here's what's at the other end. The tunnel takes a little right turn here, and in order to expand the parking lot, they just filled it all in, and there's the rubble. There's a 2x4 sticking out of the rubble, and there's a cement block I was telling you about. This is one of the beams that fell down. I believe these beams were just to hold the boards in place until the cement dried. Okay, so then they're not structural at all. This is what the grate looks like today, and this is the Princeton Ridge condominiums. You can see they built up that original wall. They built it up and put a fence on top of it, and that's all that's left is the grate. If you go inside, it's all just filled in, like the other end. So nobody will ever see the inside of that tunnel again, but you have seen it now. Nabnasset Grove. Now, Jeff Hall was here, as I said, and he's interested in Nabnasset Grove, so get ready, Jeff. Here we go. When you read the book, you'll find out that William C. Edwards built a lot of things, buildings in West Chelmsford and all over the state. This was his house. It wasn't in the book because it's just over the line in Nabnasset section of Westford. And to locate where you are, this is across the street from the Nab liquor store.
Oh, okay.
So that house is there. It's blue right now, and it doesn't look very fancy right now, but it had a lot of nice detail on it. And this was the carriage house. You see the carriage house was built, he's the guy that built the railroad station, Quessy School, the West Chelmsford Methodist Church, the Fletcher Library, and the Adams Library. I found out. I was surprised. So he had a lot of architectural style. Now we're headed into Nabnasset, so I want to get you oriented. This is the turn. This is the town line right here. This is the turn where William C. Edwards' house was, that we just looked at. This is Marshall's Hall, and my friend Bill Nolan owns that piece of property, which his house is in Chelmsford and Marshall's Hall is in Westford. That was a two-story building. It was like a community function hall upstairs and a store downstairs, and later it became like one-room apartments for transients and fell into disrepair and finally burned around 1920. Now we come down. This is Nabnasset Street going up this way. I'm just going to go down here a little ways. This corner was called Brookside Corner. There are two gas stations there, a school on this corner. Well, this little house over on this corner, and I mean little, is still there. And it belonged to Moses Edwards. And Moses Edwards and his wife, I think it was Mary, had 5 children that grew up in that little tiny house. So one of those kids was William C. Edwards. So it's amazing. He grew up in this little bitty house, and he builds these massive structures all over the place. And one of his sisters married John Whidden, who was the station master at the West Chelmsford Station on School Street. Now going up Nabnasset Street, this is Moore Street here, and he had He purchased a grove, actually. The grove already existed. Okay, notice it says G.C. Moore. Well, the grove was this entire area here, and he bought it from a fellow who lived on Main Street right there in Westford. His house is in the book in 1874. Now, he was still just a kid when he bought this whole place. So there was a house here. I'm going to show you a picture of that next. This is the house. The groundskeeper or the manager of the grove lived here. This was a barn and facilities needed for maintenance. You can see a swing set out here. This is Moore Street here. This is Oak Hill Road here. This is Nabnasset Road here. This is a boathouse that George C. Moore built, and it was in the 1800s. He had rowing boats. He had a whole fleet of rowing boats. He had a steamboat on the lake. And so when they had groups over, you could have a large church group, a large company picnic. They had all this equipment, and they kept it in this building. And if you notice, they had a door here. The door would lift up here to the second floor. And if the water wasn't so low, you could row your boat right through there. But here the water's low. Now, George C. Moore owned the rights to the water, so he could control the water level any way he wanted it. So when he needed water for his boats, he could raise it up. Over here we had kind of a scout camp, and there's a good picture of one of the buildings on this camp area. I think these were Girl Scouts, and that's the boathouse again. So this is kind of a similar view to the last one, but it shows the building. There was a complex of buildings for the camps. This is actually William C. Edwards here. And the reason I show this, he actually owned, Moore owned the southeast and east end of the lake. He actually owned the southwest end of the lake, and that's where I think this boathouse was. I think if you go this direction, you go toward the east end and the boathouse. So this is Edwards Boathouse, and I'm pretty sure this is a gasoline boat right now because there's no smokestack. This has the classic hull of a steamboat. So my theory is that either this was the steamboat that was on the lake, or this was an Edwards steamboat that was converted to gasoline, because Edwards is pretty far along at this age. Just to give you the scale now, George C. Moore and William C. Edwards were both titans of industry. They both lived at literally the same time. And here's how it worked. Edwards was born 3 years before George C. Moore, and he died 6 years after. So Edwards' life spanned all of George C. Moore's life, the whole thing. And the two of them had to have done a lot of business together, and they had to have known each other real well. The name of the boat, Edna Louise, when I was looking at the photo, it's really grainy. I was able to pick out Louise by staring at it for half an hour, looking at it from different angles. I picked out Louise, and then there was 4 letters in front of it. I had no clue. I could not figure it out. Then I was looking through Ancestry.com. Oh my God, he had a granddaughter by the name of Edna Louise. She was born in 1900. There we go. That's the Edna Louise. This is a summer theater in 1915. He built 2 barns. One was 140 feet long, the other one was closer to 100. These were massive barns. I mean, they were called some of the biggest in the whole area. And this one right here, the summer theater, only the upstairs was used for the theater. They had a stage, and they could seat, in a pinch, they could seat 1,000 people. I don't think the fire regulations today would allow 1,000 people in there. But on the downstairs, they had bowling, billiards, a dance hall, and a recreation center. So this was quite a facility, and it went along with the Grove because they had baseball fields, they had the waterfront, they had the beach, they had everything, hiking trails. Now this right here, if you look over here, there's that big barn that we were just looking at, the theater. George C. Moore got rid of the house that I showed you in the first slide, and he built another house for his family or the caretaker, whoever they needed at the time. And this was called the Nabnasset Inn in 1935. So there was actually a restaurant and an inn there. And it's actually owned by a mutual friend of Jeff and mine by the name of Rich McLaughlin. He lives there now. So here we go in 1938. The theater was gone, so this is the large barn. It's called the Nabnasset Country Club. Of course, today it's called the Nabnasset Lake Country Club. But here it is, being used by the golf club. This shows you the reason I'm showing this, not to make an eye chart, but this land over here was William C. Edwards over here. So this was his waterfront where I showed you the boat. This strip of land over here is kind of pie-shaped. This also was always Edwards' land. It was actually Moses Edwards. I told you about his little house. This is now Charles Edwards' land, his son, and William C. Edwards' brother. And guess what it's called today? It's Edwards Beach. And it's a town facility. It's one of the Westford beach facilities, and they have building, they have events, movies, all kinds of stuff, picnic tables. So George C. Moore owned this property here. George C. Moore owned all this property here. He didn't always own it. A lot of the land down here he bought in 1898, 1899, 1900. I couldn't believe it. It's like he was playing Monopoly. Every piece of land that he didn't own, between he and William C. Edwards, they owned everything you see here, except I think the Fletcher Quarry owned this section over here, and they had a recreation facility over there. So he was obsessive in accumulating wealth, property, great mills. I forgot to tell you too, on that first chart, he owned half of Brookside Mill at the time that chart was made. Oh, the other thing on here, this shows the location of the big barns. This is the clubhouse. This is the small barn, I should say, and this is the little theater because this is different time frame. This is 1940. This is a stable, and this is a paddock, and it says private property at this point. But when this was used as the Grove, they had horses here, and the paddock, stable. This is that house that became an inn that I showed you about. Okay, here we go. This is 1948. Now, the club found that it was too expensive. Their building was too expensive. So Rich helped me track down where the barn went. They sold it. A farmer bought it down on Marshall Street in Chelmsford, East Chelmsford. This is it. This is the roof of the big barn. You see the same three vents right here. The only difference is the first floor he built out of cement blocks. So he saved the upper floor with the roof. This is what it looks like outside. This is a cement block first floor. And this is the old building that you saw in those pictures as it looks today. Okay, this is the Nabnasset Lake Country Club. They moved to the two-vent building, which is a smaller barn, which is right next to, this is Nabnasset, the junction of Nabnasset and Oak Hill. This building burned in 1977, so they may still be using that if it hadn't burned. This is what the site looks like today. This is where the big barn was, and now they have a modern building. This is the foundation of the smaller barn right here. This was where the stable was. This is where that house in that picture where the groundskeeper was. So I forgot to tell you, the first groundskeeper he hired in 1876, his name was George Tyler. And he worked there until he died, lived at that house with his family. Now we're going to talk about the Carrie Tyler house. Do you see why I threw Tyler in at the last minute? This house is in Vinyl Square, and I was always fascinated because it had scrawled on the bottom somewhere. It said, not this version, but it said Carrie Tyler house. So its location today is here. This is the triangle in Vinyl Square. This is the Vietnam Monument, so it's right across the street from the Vietnam Monument, and Dr. Crane's office here. So I never made the connection between that house. I was looking for it. I never made the connection because that doesn't look like the house in that picture there. So we'll show why. So Simon Toll is a photographer that took most of the pictures in the book. That's a picture of Simon. His sister was Melissa Tyler, and her husband was George Tyler that I just mentioned. Now George died young. He died in 1881, possibly while he was working over at the Nabnasset Grove. Now I suspect that since George was working for George C. Moore, it turns out the Carrie Tyler house was owned by George C. Moore. So it would make sense that he took George Tyler's widow and had her take over with her 3 daughters, take over the house at 25 Middlesex. So, and she had 3 daughters, Mabel, Fanny, and Carrie. I'm just mentioning there was a whole long list of boarders that I found on the directories, but 2, Michael Kinch was a laborer, and Simon Toll, the photographer himself, he was listed 1 year. And I'm suspecting, since he took a lot of pictures of the mills as they were being built in this time frame, he may have moved in there temporarily so he could be there day to day because he was the official George C. Moore photographer. That's my theory, and I'm sticking to it. Okay, this is actually a picture of Carrie Tyler. And the picture was taken by Simon Toll. You can't see it because the color is the same as the background there. But his logo was down here. So Simon was Carrie's uncle. And Carrie Tyler married that boarder by the name of Michael Kinch. So they got married in 1899, and they had a son, Ralph. Now Michael died, he was only 41. So Melissa, Carrie, and Melissa's grandson, Ralph, they moved to Lowell at that point. And 2 years later, George C. Moore transferred ownership to the U.S. Worsted Company. Now, George didn't own the U.S. Worsted Company. That was a different company. He sold that in 1903. But maybe because Melissa wasn't working there anymore, it wasn't working for him. So he passed it along. Somebody else could manage it. Then in 1930, the company sold it just a year before they went out of business to Percy T. and Ruth G. Robinson. Ruth was actually Jim Watton's daughter. You remember his barn from one of the first pictures. And Percy T. Robinson ran a automotive dealership and repair shop, all in Vinyl Square. They purchased the house in 1930. So that's what happened during the years of interest, anyway. Okay, this is the same house, and this cute little kid here is Leslie Merrill, and this is Florence Queen. So Florence Queen was a daughter of Myron Queen, who was a boarder at the house. This is 1908, so George C. Moore still owned it. Melissa Tyler was running it. Myron ran a store for George C. Moore. It was actually just down the street, kind of where the Brickhouse Pizza place is by the tracks. And that's the daughter. Now, she ended up marrying the daughter of, the son, yeah, what a world. She ended up marrying the son of Arthur H. Sheldon, and Arthur H. Sheldon lived on Edwards Place just down the street. There was a rumor that she had gotten in trouble with the son, Royal Sheldon, who was George T. Sheldon's son. So my research showed that rumor was not true. She was happily married. Arthur H. Sheldon was an upstanding citizen. They got married. They moved to Boston. I know where they lived. She worked at a cardboard box company or paper box company, and he was a pattern maker. And they lived there at the same address right up to World War II. So who is Leslie Merrill here? This says Leslie. Okay, so I always saw this picture and I saw this cute little kid. Well, it turns out Leslie has a first name, John. Okay, so now I forgot to mention that Myron Queen's wife is a Merrill and happens to be George W. Merrill's sister. Okay, so this right here is George W. Merrill's son. So you say, well, why do they dress him up in a dress? Okay, well, those of you that have been through history No, okay, I had to go to Wikipedia because I didn't know. And they had, because it was for toilet training purposes, kids could not navigate the fasteners of the day, so they wore the dresses on both boys and girls. And they had a breeching ceremony, like a rite of passage, okay? So they actually dressed that way until they were between 2 and 8 years old, and then they had this ceremony and a party called breeching. So that's what it was. It was all about toilet training and coming of age. Get your pants on. Okay, this is another picture of the Carrie Tyler house, and if you look at it, it's longer than it is today. Well, what happened was the Robinsons, during their time, I believe, took out all the barns and cut the end of the house right off, okay? That's why the house is symmetrical today. And the other reason, in the old days, they used to have the front door facing south, so the front door is on the wrong side of the house, because that's the way they used to do it. So if you take this end of the house off, take away all the barns, then you get the house that's there today. And who are these girls? Okay, we got Edith Robinson and Grace Robinson. I mentioned that the Robinsons bought this house in 1930. Not the same family. These Robinsons, they were daughters of an immigrant family from England, and they lived over here on Princeton Street, right next door, okay? So they were out here playing, all dressed up, maybe some occasion, having their picture taken by this little garden. So what's the backstory here? Okay, Grace Robinson, right here. Now this is 1919. She fell in love with this guy right here, John Leslie Merrill. This is a 1908 picture. The two of them fell in love, and they got married in 1928. And they had a son, and his name was George L. Merrill, and he's sitting right there. So is that embarrassing enough, George? So here's what the house looks like today, and that's why you can't recognize it, because the house is actually shorter, and there's no barns, and in the aerial view there was actually another house built next door where the barns were. It's built out of cement blocks. Okay, now we're going to look at haunted places. So anybody know of any haunted places in town? Crystal Lake? Shucks, I missed that one. Princeton Street? Oh, Princeton Street. Okay, that sounds good. Anybody else? Tingsboro Road? Drum Hill? Coggers, really? Well, let me tell you about Coggers. Okay, this is the Middlesex Truant School. Okay, it was built about 1894. This is taken around 1900 because you can see the trees, the landscaping had been planted and is growing nicely. The pond is still there, but it's all eutrophied with weeds and stuff. This is Bigelow Hall, which is the only occupied building. This is Upham Hall, and this is Reed Hall. So why am I showing you a picture of Crystal Lake? And why am I showing you Cyrus Hamlet, whose great-great-aunt was his wife, and whose great-aunt was Florence Merrill? Well, I'll tell you why, because they lived on Whiteman Street, and Whiteman Street was right next door to the Truant School. Okay, so the backstory here, George thinks that Cyrus Merrill may have been a partner with George T. Sheldon in the ice house. This is the only picture that I've ever seen. If you ever see one, let me know, but it's the only picture that actually shows crews on Crystal Lake working the ice, and ice blocks over here, and the chain is pulling the ice up. Only picture. I've never seen one that shows the people. That's why I showed you this little piece of eye candy, just because, and it does tie in with the haunted houses a little bit, because this is Whiteman Street right here. Now, Florence, what was she doing with Cyrus? She was a lot younger than Cyrus, another generation apart. She was his housekeeper. Okay, Cyrus was getting very elderly. He was in his 80s here. So Florence was his housekeeper. Even when his wife was there, she was still a housekeeper. She never married. So here's an aerial view. This shows the 5 buildings, Bigelow, and Gould Hall and Reed Hall and Upham Hall. And this one here could have been Ipswich Hall. I've heard two different names from that, for that. There's no sign on it at all. This is Whiteman Street. I don't know which number Cyrus lived on. But the question is, he lived there when this place was being built. Were there any paranormal or supernatural effects going on? We can't ask them because they died a few years back. So here is what's happening today. Okay, in 2013, a book came out called Haunted Colleges and Universities of Massachusetts. And I'll just quote it quick. I won't tell this story. I'll just quote it and let you decide. The West Campus of ULowell in Chelmsford, Massachusetts has ascended to near legendary status among the urban explorers and ghost hunters in the New England area. Today, ghostly screams emanate loudly from the abandoned buildings, and an air of sadness and pain radiates from this place. Inside Gould Hall didn't look much different than Reed and Ipswich Halls had. Some mold, dirt, and debris, but just felt terrible. Melissa couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in the building. She kept feeling fingers poking at her and running up and down her skin. At one point, she turned quickly, started to yell, convinced that a man was behind her, touching her blonde hair. So you can see in circles that believe in this, now I personally not a believer, but I've heard a few stories since from people that live in the new 55 and older housing that they hear strange things too. This is the back of Gould Hall that they mentioned. This is probably how the ghost hunters get in. They probably break in through one of the doors and windows back here. Reed Hall, this same year, 2013, somebody, it got torched, basically. It was a set fire. There was no electricity to the building. It was unused. This is the demolition process here. So it was kind of sad because it was, I mean, it was a nice, it could have been, might have been used for something, but not now. Okay, this is a bigger view. You mentioned Coggers. Coggers is this area. This is Princeton Street. This is Route 4, Drum Hill. And this is Drum Hill Road, which turns into Westford Road right here at, right here at Parkhurst. Okay, this is Westford Street from here down to here. I think it turns into Wood Street. So anyway, this is Whiteman Street here. And I mentioned Dingwell Street, where George W. Merrill lived at. Well, this is Dingwell Street right here. And if you look here, this is a funny road, Carl Street. I never could figure out Carl Street until I'm gonna explain to you. Now we know exactly what Carl Street was. Carl Street used to connect over here to Parkhurst Road. And then this little junction right here, that's now industrial, that used to connect directly over to Dingwell Road. So that's what it used to look like. Now, here we have the over 55 housing. And there are reports, because you can see how close they live. They reported hearing noises and so on. I'm a skeptic. I think because they were housing girls there for a while, troubled girls, that there may have been noises occasionally. You know, troubled people make noise. Or old buildings, you know, or trees falling. There's a number of reasons in my mind, but maybe they know what they're talking about. Maybe it's all true. So Coggers consisted of what used to be the Drum Hill gravel pit. That's what we all knew it as. And it used to be in back of the businesses here on Drum Hill. It used to be kind of a dumping ground. And it was a big pond because a fellow by the name of John Coggers owned it, and he excavated all the sand out. And it was because of his previous ownership that the kids called it Coggers. They didn't know why at the time. The name caught on and stuck. Okay, this is a book. This also came out in 2013, and my wife bought it for me. We read it. It's written by Norman Shaw, who grew up on this Corey Street, which is the next street over from Whiteman. So Norman Shaw grew up on this street right here, and just because I can, my wife and I lived here in 1970. So we lived here in 1970 at the same time that Norman Shaw lived here when he was experiencing some of his paranormal. And I have to say, I personally didn't experience any paranormal. Maybe I was far enough away over here on Princeton Street that I didn't feel the energy coming through. Okay, he makes a pretty big claim here. That's what we were doing there on that beautiful New England night, trying to pick up on the spirit world. We were sitting in the most haunted place in North America. Now that's a pretty big claim, doing it. While you might argue with me over this and bring up other locations you've heard or read about, Coggers was the real deal. Sometimes I would see little wisps of smoke or energy or whatever you want to call it dancing about. Dave, Chris, and I had been in Coggers for about an hour or so. We had felt and sensed more in that time than most people do in their whole lives. Okay, so there's your Coggers. Now that's just an excerpt. The book is fun reading, but as an author, he's self-published. He did not have an editor, and he did not have spell check. It drove me bananas. Okay, now this is that intersection I was telling you about where, and I told you that Carl Street used to go, see this is Parkhurst, Carl Street. It's now a driveway that goes into the Siemens parking lot, and then the entrance, the other entrance to Siemens parking lot comes out and crosses. So wouldn't you like to go back in time and see what that intersection looked like in the 1940s, would you? Sure. Let's do it. This was the house of Herman Durrell. He used to work at the Proctor Lumber Company. And his daughter, Donna Bulka, gave me a call. I went up into New Hampshire last year and picked up several. You'll find several of her other pictures in the book. I couldn't find a place for this, but I just found a place for it now, so you could watch it, because it's a real piece of eye candy. This is Parkhurst Road. This is Carl Street right here. And you go down here a ways, and then that's where Dingwall came in. And this is Drum Hill Road. And right here is the line, and this is Westford right here. So there's a nice house over here. This is where the Gulf gas station is. This is where the McDonald's is. This is Saints Memorial Health Drop-In Care. I think it used to be a Popeyes. And the Enterprise Bank is right over here. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.